June 1983, Piedmont County, North Carolina. The air hung thick and heavy, smelling of damp earth and hot metal. For the first time in 34 years, the floor of Miller's Valley was open to the sun. The great reservoir, Miller's Lake, was gone. Drained. What remained was 180 acres of gray, cracked silt, a testament to a county decision made with slide rules and engineering reports. Arthur Wallace stood on the edge of his property, his fence line now bordering this new, strange desert. He was 72 years old, a man shaped by the land he stood on. His hands were thick, the knuckles swollen, the skin a permanent map of sun and work. His face was lean, his eyes a pale, washed-out blue that saw things in terms of seasons and soil, not quarterly reports or 5-year plans. He wore denim overalls over a faded chambray shirt, the uniform of his life. The problem lay before him, a vast, ugly scar. The County Water Authority had condemned the Miller's Lake Dam. Decades of silt had reduced the reservoir's capacity, and a state inspection had found hairline fractures in the concrete spillway. Repair was too expensive. Decommissioning was the only viable option. So they had opened the sluice gates in the spring and let the water pour down the Haw Creek, bleeding the lake dry over the course of 2 months. Now the result baked under the Carolina sun. The lake bed was not soil, not in any way a farmer would recognize. It was a sterile, concrete, hard pan of compacted sediment. In the lowest points, where the last of the water had evaporated, it was a foul-smelling, gelatinous muck. In the higher areas, the surface was a mosaic of deep, jagged cracks, some wide enough to swallow a boot. Nothing grew there, not a weed, not a blade of grass. It was a dead place. The history of failure on this particular piece of ground was, for now, short but absolute. The county, in a fit of optimistic bureaucracy, had offered 5-year agricultural leases on the reclaimed land for a pittance. They envisioned fields of soybeans or corn, a tax-generating asset returned to the rolls. 2 farmers, younger men with big new tractors and bigger bank loans, had taken the leases on the eastern sections. They had tried to work it. One had brought in a Case 4890, a 4-wheel drive beast that weighed nearly 20,000 pounds. It had sunk to its axles in a soft spot that looked solid, and it had taken 2 wreckers the better part of a day to pull it out. The other had tried to break the hardpan with a heavy disc harrow, only to shear 3 disc spindles and burn out a clutch. After a month of fighting, they both declared the land impossible and terminated their leases, forfeiting their deposits. The land had defeated modern horsepower. The men at the Piedmont Hardware and Feed talked about it over coffee in the mornings. They called it the Miller Mudflat, or the county's folly. It was an accepted fact, a piece of local law already setting like concrete. The lake bed was useless, a permanent wound on the landscape. They pitied Arthur, whose quiet farm was now abutted by this wasteland. They did not know that Arthur had quietly, without fanfare, taken the lease on the 40-acre section directly below his own property. He did this after the other 2 had given up. He did not use a lawyer. He walked into the county clerk's office, handed over a cashier's check drawn on his own account, and signed the papers with a steady hand. He was debt-free, a status his neighbors found both admirable and perplexing. He owned his land, his house, and his equipment outright. This small lease was the first official transaction he had made with the county in over a decade. The next week, a white sedan with a state government seal on the door rolled down the gravel lane that led to Arthur's farm. A young man stepped out. He wore polished boots, crisp khaki pants, and a polo shirt with a University Extension logo embroidered on the chest. He carried a stainless steel clipboard and a soil auger. He looked about 30, with a confident, easy posture that came from having a degree and a clear set of procedures to follow. "Mr. Arthur Wallace?" he asked, extending a hand. His grip was firm and dry. My name is Daniel Henderson. I'm with the state's Soil and Water Conservation Service. The county asked me to do a final assessment on the Miller Lake reclamation area. Arthur nodded, wiping his own hand on his overalls before shaking Henderson's. He did not offer a smile, but his expression was not unkind. Henderson, he said, acknowledging the name. I was just looking over the lease records. Henderson continued, flipping a page on his clipboard. I see you've taken the lease on Parcel 7. I'll be honest with you, Mr. Wallace. My preliminary report recommends the county abandon the agricultural initiative altogether. This land, it's just not viable. Arthur's gaze drifted past the young man, out toward the cracked grey expanse. He remained silent. His silence was not a challenge, but a space. He was listening, but he was also looking at the way the light fell on the far side of the valley, at the line of willow trees that marked the old creek bed. Henderson took the silence as a sign of rustic incomprehension. He adopted a slightly more pedagogical tone. See, the problem is twofold. First, you have extreme compaction. Decades of water pressure have squeezed every bit of air out of this silt. It's essentially sedimentary rock now. There's no porosity. Water can't penetrate, and roots can't grow. He gestured with his pen. Second, the soil chemistry is a complete disaster. We've got high levels of anaerobic bacteria, manganese, and iron deposits. The pH is all over the place. Anything you plant here would suffer from nutrient lockout and oxygen starvation. It would be a waste of seed and fertilizer. He walked over to the edge of the hardpan and expertly twisted the soil auger into the ground. It bit into the top inch, then screeched to a halt. Henderson grunted, putting his weight into it. The auger refused to go deeper. He pulled it out, showing Arthur the tiny plug of grey, dense material. See, it's like trying to plant a crop in a parking lot, he said. He seemed satisfied with his demonstration. My recommendation to the county will be to seed it with a native grass mix designed for erosion control and just let it go back to scrub. That's the best anyone can hope for here. He looked at Arthur with an expression of professional pity. I just wanted to let you know before you spent any time or money on it. The county should never have offered these leases in the first place. It's false hope. Arthur looked at the small sample of earth in the auger. He looked at Henderson's clean boots. He looked back out at the 40 acres of cracked, dead-looking land. He thought of his father. He thought of a promise made a long time ago. Appreciate you stopping by, Arthur said. His voice was quiet, a low rumble. It was the only thing he said during the entire conversation. Henderson waited for a moment, expecting a question, an argument, perhaps a complaint about the county. He received none. He gave a slight shrug, a gesture that said, I tried. All right then, Mr. Wallace, you have a good day. He got back in his sedan, made a neat three-point turn in the grass, and drove away, leaving a small cloud of dust to settle in the still air. The men at the diner heard about it a few days later. Henderson had filed his report, and the county manager had mentioned it to one of the commissioners, who mentioned it to his brother-in-law, who sold seed at the feed store. The story spread quickly. The expert from the state had officially declared the lake bed a lost cause, and old Arthur Wallace had gone and leased a piece of it. Poor old Arthur, said one man, stirring his coffee. His father Thomas was sharp as a tack, but I think Arthur might have spent a little too much time in the sun. He hasn't bought a new piece of equipment since that Ford tractor in '75. Another added, probably doesn't understand what it takes to farm anymore. You can't work land like that with old junk. It's a shame, said a third. He's got that nice, clean farm his father left him. Now he's going to pour what little he has into that mud pit. There's no fool like an old fool. They spoke with a casual, comfortable certainty. They had seen the failed attempts of the younger farmers. They had heard the expert's opinion. The case was closed. Arthur Wallace was making a mistake, a final public folly at the end of a long, quiet life. They felt sorry for him. Arthur did not hear their talk, but he would have recognized its tune. He had heard it all his life. He heard it when his father refused to plant the new hybrid tobacco variety that promised higher yields but exhausted the soil. He heard it when he himself decided to keep a small herd of dairy cows long after the big corporate dairies made it unprofitable. He had a different ledger book, one that measured value in things other than dollars per acre. He understood their logic. It was the logic of the surface. He was concerned with what lay beneath. That evening, Arthur sat in his father's old armchair in the living room. The house was quiet, filled only with the ticking of a grandfather clock and the chirping of crickets outside. He pulled a heavy, leather-bound ledger from the bottom drawer of a roll-top desk. It was one of 12, a complete set spanning his father's entire life on this farm. The ink on the page was faded to a soft brown. The handwriting was a precise, elegant script. This was his father's journal, but it was more than that. It was a manual for this specific piece of the earth. He turned to the entry dated April 12th, 1949. He had read it 100 times before. The narrative shifted, the present fading into the memory it was built upon. He was no longer a 72-year-old man in a quiet house. He was a boy of 18, walking the valley with his father, Thomas Wallace. The valley was alive then. A small, clear stream named Miller's Creek meandered through it. The land wasn't flat. It rolled gently, with low rises and shallow swales. The bottom land, near the creek, was covered in a thick carpet of grass, clover, and wildflowers. His father carried the same soil auger Henderson had used, but his was older, the wood handle worn smooth by his hands. "They're going to put it all under water, Arthur," Thomas had said. His voice was not angry, but full of a deep, resonant sorrow. The county commissioners had just approved the dam project. It was hailed as progress, a source of recreation, and a reliable water supply for the growing town. Thomas was one of the few who had spoken against it. He was not against progress, he was against foolishness. "People see a valley, and they see a hole to be filled," his father continued, stopping near a cluster of willow trees. "They don't see what's here. This is the best soil in the county, alluvial deposits. For 1,000 years, that creek has flooded and laid down a layer of fine silt, year after year. It's a gift." He had twisted the auger into the ground. It slid in with a soft, cutting sound, going down a full 2 feet with little effort. When he pulled it out, the core was a rich, dark brown, almost black. It was crumbly and moist, smelling of life and decay and minerals. "Look at that," Thomas said, holding it out for his son to see. "That's loam. You can't buy this. You can't make it with a bag of fertilizer. God makes it with water and time." They had walked the entire 40-acre parcel that day, the very same parcel Arthur now leased. His father took samples every 50 yards. He pointed out the different types of soil. The dark, heavy loam near the creek. The slightly sandier, lighter soil on the rises. The small patches of reddish clay, which he said were good for holding water. He was not just looking, he was reading the land, a text written over millennia. The core principle was something Thomas had repeated often, a central tenet of his farming philosophy. "The water doesn't destroy the land, Arthur," he had said, standing on a low hill and looking out over the valley. "It just covers it. It holds it in trust. They think they're building a lake, but what they're really building is a vault. The soil will be down there, waiting. Soil has a long memory. Water can't wash away what the earth is made of." That night, Thomas had sat at his desk and recorded everything. He drew a detailed map of the 40 acres. He marked the exact path of Miller's Creek. He noted the locations of 3 small natural springs that bubbled up near a rock outcropping. He described the soil composition in each section, using his own terms: creek bottom black, hickory rise loam, red clay seam. He measured the depth of the topsoil on each rise and in each swale. It was a perfect, detailed survey of a piece of land that was about to disappear from the world. Arthur gently traced the lines on the hand-drawn map. The paper was thick and soft with age. Here was the creek bed, a gentle S-curve running through the middle of the parcel. Here were the springs, marked with small circles. And here, in the margin, was a note written in his father's hand. The clay pan is 12 feet down. The old channels will drain it if they can be opened. That was the secret, the key. Henderson, with his modern tools and shallow samples, saw only the top layer, the impermeable cap of lake silt. He saw a parking lot. His father, with his deep knowledge and his old auger, had seen the structure beneath. He knew that the original valley floor, with its rich soil and natural drainage channels, was still there, preserved like a fossil under the grey blanket of sediment. The problem wasn't that the land was useless. The problem was that it was sealed off. The task was not to fix the silt, but to bypass it, to reach down and reconnect with the living earth that was waiting below. Arthur closed the journal. The house was dark now, but he did not need a lamp. The map was etched in his memory. He knew what he had to do. The math did not require a pencil. The plan did not require a committee. It required patience and the right tool. The next morning, Arthur walked to the back of his main barn. It was a large, old structure built by his grandfather with hand-hewn oak beams. In the far corner, under a dusty canvas tarp, sat a machine that had not been started in 5 years. It was a 1958 John Deere 420 crawler. It was a small tractor, an industrial model with tracks instead of wheels. It was painted a faded construction yellow. It was not powerful by modern standards, with a small 2-cylinder gasoline engine. But it had 2 crucial advantages. It was light, with a ground pressure of less than 5 pounds per square inch, which meant it could travel over the fragile crust of the lakebed without sinking. And it was his. He had bought it 30 years ago for digging drainage ditches. He pulled off the tarp. The tracks were rusty, the paint was peeling, but the machine was sound. He checked the oil. It was clean. He opened the petcock on the carburetor bowl. A trickle of old, varnish-smelling gasoline ran out. He drained the fuel tank, pouring the old gas into a waste can. He filled it with fresh, ethanol-free gasoline from a red 5-gallon can. He checked the battery terminals, scraping them clean with a pocket knife. He connected a battery charger and let it hum for an hour. While the battery charged, he went to another shed. Hanging on the wall was a single-shank subsoiler. It was a simple, brutal-looking implement. Just a long, curved piece of heavy steel, sharpened to a point at the bottom, mounted on a 3-point hitch frame. It was designed to be dragged deep through the ground, breaking up compacted soil layers or hardpan far below the reach of a normal plough. He greased the hitch points and dragged it out into the sunlight. With the battery charged, Arthur climbed onto the steel seat of the crawler. He set the throttle, pulled the choke, and pressed the starter button. The little 2-cylinder engine turned over slowly, then coughed once. He pushed the choke in halfway. He pressed the starter again. The engine coughed twice, then caught, settling into its distinctive rhythmic popping sound. Pop-pop. 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 The sound echoed in the quiet barn, a voice from another era. A thin puff of blue smoke cleared from the exhaust stack. Arthur let it warm up for a full 10 minutes, his hand resting on the throttle lever, feeling the vibration of the machine. It felt solid. It felt ready. He carefully backed the crawler out of the barn, its steel tracks clanking on the concrete floor. He hitched up the subsoiler, a process he did by himself, lining up the tractor and the implement with an economy of movement born of long practice. Then he drove the small machine slowly down the gentle slope of his pasture toward the edge of the grey wasteland. He did not head for the center of the field. He did not start ploughing in straight, efficient lines. He consulted no laser level, no GPS. He carried his father's journal in a canvas bag slung over his shoulder. He stopped the tractor at the fence line and walked out onto the lake bed, his boots crunching on the dried silt. He walked with his head down, not looking at the horizon, but at the ground beneath his feet. He was looking for signs only he could understand. A subtle change in the color of the silt. A faint depression, almost invisible in the cracked surface. A line of scrubby willows on the far bank. He was aligning the map in his head, and the map in the journal, with the reality under his feet. After an hour of walking, he found it. A place where the grey silt was a slightly darker shade, where the cracks in the surface were shallower. He took a small flag on a wire stake from his bag and pushed it into the ground. He walked another 50 feet, following an invisible curve, and planted another. He continued this process slowly and deliberately until he had a winding line of flags that snaked across the 40-acre parcel. To an observer, it would have looked random, nonsensical. To Arthur, it was the precise location of the old Miller's Creek channel, hidden 12 inches below the surface. He returned to the crawler. He took a deep breath. He engaged the clutch, and the little tractor moved forward, clanking its way onto the forbidden ground. The tracks distributed its weight perfectly. It did not sink. He drove to the first flag, lowered the subsoiler until its point bit into the hard crust, and then pushed the throttle forward. The engine's popping deepened to a serious growl. The steel shank of the subsoiler fought against the compacted silt. For a moment, the track spun, digging into the grey dust. Then the point broke through the hardpan layer. The tractor lurched forward. A deep, narrow furrow began to appear behind the machine, a dark, moist line in the pale grey landscape. Arthur was not ploughing. He was performing surgery. He set the subsoiler to run 24 inches deep, far deeper than a normal plough could reach, deep enough to shatter the impermeable layer of lake sediment and connect to the old porous soil beneath. He drove slowly, his eyes fixed on the line of flags, the little engine working at the edge of its power. The process was painfully slow. The crawler moved at a walking pace. It would take days, maybe weeks, to trace the entire length of the old creek bed and its tributaries. A car slowed on the county road that ran along the far side of the valley. It was one of his neighbors, the one who had tried to disc the land and failed. He stopped his truck, got out, and stared across the expanse. He saw the tiny yellow tractor crawling like a beetle across the grey waste, pulling a single thin line behind it. He watched for 5 minutes, his face a mixture of pity and disbelief. Then he shook his head, got back in his truck, and drove away. The story would be all over the diner by morning. Old Arthur Wallace was out on the mudflat with that antique crawler of his, trying to scratch a line in the dirt. The consensus would be that the old man had finally lost his mind. Arthur paid them no mind. He was focused on the work. He felt the tractor lurch as the subsoiler hit a buried rock. He heard the engine strain as it pulled through a section of dense clay. He was not just driving, he was feeling the land through the machine. Each vibration, each change in engine note, told him something about the unseen world his subsoiler was traveling through. He was reawakening the ghost of the old creek. For 2 weeks he worked, every day from sunrise until the light began to fail. He stopped only to refuel the tractor and to eat a simple lunch of a sandwich and an apple, which he ate sitting on the tractor's steel seat, looking out over his slow progress. The single dark line became a network. He cut the main channel first, following the S-curve of the old creek. Then he cut the smaller, secondary lines, the feeder streams and drainage paths his father had so carefully mapped. He was not turning the soil over. He was simply opening it up from below, creating deep, hidden channels that would allow air and water to penetrate the dead zone. Daniel Henderson drove by one afternoon. He was on his way to inspect a new terracing project on a farm 10 miles up the road. He saw the little yellow tractor and pulled his sedan over, got out and watched, his arms crossed. He saw the seemingly random pattern of furrows. It looked like a child scribbling on a massive scale. It violated every principle of modern soil management he had been taught. It was inefficient. It was illogical. He saw no dissing, no ploughing, no preparation of a seedbed. Just a man on an old machine, cutting deep, lonely lines in a field of baked mud. He shook his head, a small, sad smile on his face. He had tried to warn the old man. He had presented the scientific data. He had offered his professional, educated opinion. But some people, he thought, just had to learn the hard way. He took a picture with a camera from his car to document the futile effort for his report. He labeled the photo, Parcel 7, Unsanctioned and Inadvisable Tillage Attempt. Then he drove on, confident in his assessment, certain of the outcome. By the end of the third week, Arthur was finished with the subsoiling. The 40-acre plot was now covered in a web of deep, narrow furrows. From the road, it looked no different than before. The lines were hard to see unless you were standing right over them. The surface was still a cracked, grey shield. But underneath, everything had changed. The land could breathe again. His next step was just as unconventional. He did not plant corn or soybeans. He did not bring in truckloads of lime and fertilizer to correct the chemical imbalances. He went to his own seed shed and brought out burlap sacks of two specific types of seed. One was buckwheat, the other was a variety of forage radish, often called a tillage radish, with a massive, deep taproot. He used an old broadcast seeder mounted on the back of his Ford 8N tractor, the one he'd bought in 1975. This tractor had rubber tires, but he fitted it with a second set of wheels on each axle, creating a dual-wheel setup that spread the tractor's weight, allowing it to travel on the lake bed without compacting the soil around his newly cut channels. He sowed the seeds heavily, casting them across the entire 40 acres. The men at the feed store were baffled. "Buckwheat?" one said, laughing. "What's he going to do, make pancakes for the whole county? There's no market for buckwheat." "And tillage radishes," said another. "You plant those to break up ploughpan, but Arthur hasn't ploughed a thing. He's just scratching lines. The seed is just going to sit on that baked mud and die." They did not understand. Arthur wasn't planting for a harvest he could sell. He was planting for a harvest the soil could use. Buckwheat grows fast, even in poor soil, and its dense root system is excellent at extracting phosphorus, a nutrient that Henderson's report had shown was locked up in the lakebed sediment. When the buckwheat was tilled in, that phosphorus would become available to the next crop. The tillage radishes were his living subsoilers. Their thick taproots would grow downwards, following the paths of least resistance his deep furrows had created, driving deep into the soil. They would die over the winter, and their rotting roots would leave behind large, deep holes, further aerating the soil and creating channels for water. They would be a massive infusion of organic matter, the one thing the sterile lakebed desperately needed. He was using plants as his primary tools. After he finished seeding, all he could do was wait. Wait for the rain. He watched the sky every day. The summer was hot and dry. The seeds lay dormant on the grey, dusty surface. The whispers in town grew louder. Arthur's folly was turning out to be just that. He had spent weeks on that crawler, burning fuel and time, and now his expensive seed was just bird food. Arthur remained patient. He had seen droughts before. He knew the weather would turn. He spent the time maintaining his other equipment, mending fences on the rest of his farm, and reading his father's journals in the evenings. He was not worried. His father had taught him that farming was an act of faith, but a faith grounded in deep observation and understanding. The plan was sound. The work was done. The rest was up to the sky. In the second week of August, the weather broke. Dark, heavy clouds rolled in from the west. The air grew still and smelled of ozone. Then the rain came. It was not a gentle shower, but a deluge, a thunderstorm that dropped 2 inches of rain in 3 hours. The neighbors watched the storm, and they thought of Arthur's field. They imagined the water sheeting off the hard, baked surface, carrying all his seed and loose soil with it, washing it down into the creek, a total loss. They imagined the field would be a landscape of erosion gullies by morning. But that is not what happened. The next morning, Arthur stood at the edge of the field. The air was clean and cool. The 40-acre plot was transformed. There were no gullies. There was no standing water. The entire 2 inches of rain had been absorbed. The deep channels he had cut with the subsoiler had acted like a massive drainage system in reverse, catching the rainfall and funneling it deep into the ground, rehydrating the soil from below. The grey, dusty surface was now a uniform dark brown, the colour of damp, healthy earth. A week later, the first signs of success appeared. A faint green haze, visible only in the early morning light. The buckwheat and radishes had germinated. They grew with astonishing speed. Within 3 weeks, the entire 40-acre plot, the land that had been declared dead and sterile, was covered in a thick, lush carpet of vibrant green. It was a shocking, impossible sight. The green stood in stark contrast to the barren, untouched lakebed on the neighbouring parcels. It was an island of life in a sea of grey. The talk in town changed. Pity turned to bewilderment. The men at the hardware store drove out to the county road to see it for themselves. They stood in a small group, staring at the field. They could not understand it. It made no sense according to the rules they knew. "How did he get that stand?" one asked. "There's not a bare patch on it." "And look at the colour of it," another said. "That's not starved-looking stuff. That's healthy." They had no explanation. They fell back on old country superstitions. "Arthur's always been lucky," one concluded, though he did not sound convinced. It was not luck, it was knowledge. Daniel Henderson was driving back from a meeting when he saw it. He had to pull his car over. He thought he was in the wrong place. He checked the parcel map he kept on his passenger seat. It was Parcel 7. His report, the one based on soil samples and chemical analysis, had stated with scientific certainty that this was impossible. And yet, there it was. 40 acres of thriving green life. He got out of his car and walked to the edge of the field. He was no longer the confident young expert. He was a man confronted with a fact that dismantled his understanding of the world. He knelt down, pushing aside the thick leaves of the buckwheat. The soil beneath was not cracked and hard. It was dark, moist, and crumbly. He could push his finger into it up to the second knuckle. He saw the thick, white shoulders of the tillage radishes already starting to swell, driving their way down into the earth. He stood there for a long time, in silent contemplation. The field was not just growing, it was thriving. It was a living, breathing refutation of his report. His spreadsheets, his lab results, his degree, they had all been wrong. And this old farmer, with his ancient tractor and his silent ways, had been right. It was a humbling, deeply unsettling moment. He felt a profound sense of confusion, but also a flicker of something else. Respect. By late September, the buckwheat had flowered, covering the field in a blanket of delicate white blossom. The air hummed with the sound of bees. Arthur waited until the first seeds began to set. Then he started up his Ford tractor, this time with a disc harrow attached. He drove into the field and tilled the entire crop under. He turned all of that lush green biomass, all of that captured sunlight and atmospheric nitrogen, back into the soil. This act confused the onlookers even more than the planting had. To destroy such a beautiful, healthy crop seemed the height of wastefulness. But Arthur was not finished. He was still preparing the ground. He let the tilled-in crop decompose for a few weeks. Then he brought in a truckload of something Henderson's report had said the soil desperately needed, but which the report had assumed would have to be applied at great expense. Calcium. Arthur's source was not a chemical company, it was the local chicken processing plant. He got several tons of ground eggshells for nearly free, and he spread them across the field. A slow-release, natural source of calcium carbonate. As winter approached, the tillage radishes completed their work. The first hard frosts killed their green tops. Underground, the huge white roots, some of them 2 feet long, began to rot. As they decomposed, they left behind a network of deep, open channels filled with rich organic matter. The earthworms, which had been absent from the sterile silt, began to appear, drawn by the feast. The soil was coming alive. That winter, Arthur did not work the field. He let it rest. He let the frost and the snow and the freezing and thawing cycles continue the work he had started, breaking down the clods, mellowing the soil. He had done the heavy lifting. Now he was letting nature do its part. In the spring of 1984, a year after the lake was drained, Arthur prepared the field for its first real crop. When he worked the soil this time, it was transformed. The grey, concrete-like silt was gone. In its place was a dark, fragrant, and friable loam. It was alive. He decided to plant a strain of open-pollinated corn, a variety his father had grown called Hickory King. It was not a modern hybrid designed for maximum yield under ideal, chemically fed conditions. It was an old Appalachian variety known for its deep roots, its drought tolerance, and its ability to thrive in rich bottomland soil. It was the perfect crop for this reborn land. The corn grew. It grew with a vigor that was startling. By July it was over 8 feet tall, the stalks thick and sturdy, the leaves a deep, healthy green. Each stalk produced 2 large, well-filled ears. There were no signs of nutrient deficiency, no pest problems, no disease. The land, which had been pronounced dead, was pouring its stored-up energy into this magnificent crop. The climax, the final, undeniable result, came in October, at harvest time. Arthur used an old 2-row corn picker, pulled by his Ford tractor. The picker was slow, but it did the job. He filled 1 wooden corn crib, then another. He filled a 3rd, and then a 4th. When he was finished, and the last load was in, he sat down and did the calculations. He had measured the acreage precisely. He had weighed the yield. The 40-acre field had produced an average of 180 bushels of shelled corn per acre. The county average for corn that year, on established, well-fertilized fields, was 130 bushels per acre. Arthur's field, the useless, sterile mudflat, had outperformed them all by nearly 40%, and he had done it without a single pound of commercial nitrogen fertilizer. He had used only his father's knowledge, an old tractor, and 2 cover crops. The success was absolute, it was undeniable, it was quiet, and it was profound. A week after the harvest was complete, the white state sedan appeared again at the end of Arthur's Lane. Daniel Henderson got out. He was dressed the same, but his posture was different. The easy confidence was gone, replaced by a quiet humility. He did not carry his clipboard. He walked up to the farmhouse where Arthur was sitting on the porch, cleaning a piece of equipment. Henderson stopped at the bottom of the steps. He looked at Arthur, then out at the harvested cornfield, where the cut stalks stood in neat rows. "Mr. Wallace," he began, his voice quiet. He cleared his throat. I came to say that I was wrong." The words seemed to cost him an effort, but he said them clearly. "My report was wrong. My analysis was wrong. Everything I thought I knew about that piece of land was wrong." Arthur stopped his work. He looked at the young man. He saw no arrogance left in him, only a genuine, searching curiosity. He gave a slight nod, an invitation to continue. "I've been going over it and over it in my head," Henderson said, taking a step up. "I've looked at the soil maps, the geological survey, everything. Nothing explains it. Nothing explains how you took 180 bushels an acre off land, that my tests said couldn't even grow weeds. I came here today because I need to understand. If you're willing to tell me, I'm ready to listen." This was the moment Arthur had been waiting for. Not for the apology, but for the question. The apology was for the man. The question was for the knowledge. Arthur gestured to the other rocking chair on the porch. "Sit down," he said. Henderson sat. Arthur went inside the house and came back a moment later with the old leather-bound journal, the one dated 1940. He did not open it. He just held it in his lap. "You were looking at the skin," Arthur said, his voice calm and plain. "You saw the scar tissue left by the lake. You were right about that. It was dead. But you were only looking at the top foot." He leaned forward and opened the journal on a small table between them. He turned to the hand-drawn map of the valley. "My father made this," Arthur said. "The week before they started clearing the trees to build the dam. He walked this whole valley. He knew it, not as a plot of land, but as a living thing. He knew where the creek ran, where the springs were, where the good soil was." He traced the lines on the map with his finger. "Your report called the land poorly drained." And it was. The silt on top had sealed it like a bucket. But the original valley floor, underneath all that, had its own drainage. This creek bed, it was still there. The soil was still there. My father wrote it all down. He pointed to the note in the margin. "The clay pan is 12 feet down. The old channels will drain it if they can be opened." "That was the whole idea," Arthur explained. "I didn't try to fix the silt. I just cut through it. I used that old crawler and the subsoiler to open up the old creek channels, 24 inches deep. I let the air and the rain get down to the good soil that was waiting underneath. The land drained itself, just like it used to." Henderson stared at the map, then back at Arthur. Understanding began to dawn on his face. "The subsoiler, those random lines. You were following this map." "That's right," Arthur said. "I was reopening the veins." "And the buckwheat? The radishes?" "The land was starved for life," Arthur said simply. "It needed organic matter. It needed roots to break it up. The cover crops were the first meal. They brought the soil back to life. The worms came back. The fungi. The bacteria. You can't have a crop without them. They do most of the work." He explained the role of the buckwheat in mining phosphorus, the way the rotting radish roots created deep channels for the corn roots to follow. He spoke plainly, without a trace of gloating. He was not teaching a lesson to a humbled student. He was simply explaining the nature of the place. He was passing on the facts as he had learned them from his father, and as the land itself had proven them to be true. Henderson was silent for a long time, studying the journal. He looked at the careful handwriting, the detailed notes, the precise map. This was a different kind of data. It was not collected by a lab or processed by a computer. It was collected by a man's feet and his hands and his eyes over the course of a lifetime. It was deeper, more specific, and ultimately more accurate than anything his own science had been able to produce. "This," Henderson said, gesturing to the journal, "this is a masterpiece. This kind of record, it doesn't exist anymore." "It exists if you make it," Arthur said. A few months later, a new report was issued by the State Soil and Water Conservation Service. It was written by Daniel Henderson. It was a formal addendum to his original assessment of the Miller Lake reclamation area. It recommended that the county not abandon the agricultural project, but instead adopt a new, historically informed, low-impact reclamation strategy. The report detailed, in precise scientific language, the success of the methods used on Parcel 7. It spoke of utilizing pre-existing hydrological features, deep channel aeration, and biological soil conditioning with cover crops. It did not mention Arthur Wallace by name, referring to him only as a local landowner with multi-generational knowledge of the site. But it was a complete and total vindication of his work. The report concluded that with this new approach, the rest of the Miller Lake bed could be brought into productive agricultural use within 2 years. It was a systemic change, a quiet revolution in a government document. The knowledge had been adopted. The next year, 2 new farmers, younger and more cautious than the first pair, leased the remaining parcels of the lake bed. They did not bring in massive tractors. They came to Arthur's door first, hats in hand. He did not give them his father's journal, but he walked the land with them. He showed them how to find the traces of the old channels. He told them about the buckwheat and the radishes. He taught them the method. And their fields, in time, also turned from grey to green. The Miller mudflat became Miller Valley again. It was no longer a scar. It was a landscape of quiet, productive fields, a testament to a deeper kind of wisdom. The old John Deere 420 crawler sat back in its corner of the barn, under its canvas tarp. It had done its work. It was a symbol, a physical link to a way of thinking that valued patience over speed and precision over brute force. It was a tool that fit the scale of the problem. It did not conquer the land, it cooperated with it. It had waited, silent for years, for the right job to come along, a job that no bigger, newer machine could do. It was a piece of enduring practical knowledge, cast in iron. The new normal settled over the valley. People forgot that the land had ever been called useless. The cornfields on the old lake bed became an accepted part of the local geography. The story of Arthur's folly faded, replaced by a quiet, grudging respect. He became known as the man who understood the valley. His success was no longer remarkable. It was simply a fact, as solid and dependable as the land itself. One cool autumn afternoon, 5 years after the first harvest, a car pulled into Arthur's lane. It was not Henderson's white sedan. It was a dusty pickup truck, and a young woman got out. She looked to be in her late 20s, with bright, intelligent eyes and practical work boots. "Mr. Wallace?" she asked, approaching the porch where Arthur sat. "My name is Sarah Jenkins. I'm the new county agricultural agent. Dan Henderson retired last spring. He told me that if I wanted to understand the land in this county, the first thing I should do is come talk to you." Arthur looked at her. He saw the same earnest curiosity he had eventually seen in Henderson, but in her it was there from the start. She was not there to tell him anything. She was there to learn. She was the successor. He nodded slowly. "He told you right." He went inside and brought out his father's journal. He opened it to the map. He began to explain, his voice low and steady, telling her the story of the land, of the water, and of the soil that remembers. He was passing the torch. He was ensuring the knowledge would not be lost. He was planting a seed in a new mind, a seed that would grow and nourish the community long after he was gone. The sun was low in the sky, casting long shadows across the porch. The air was crisp, smelling of cured hay and turned earth. Arthur pointed to a line in the journal, a simple sentence his father had written all those years ago. "The land will tell you what it needs if you know how to listen." Sarah Jenkins leaned closer, reading the faded script, her face intent. The knowledge was being passed. The cycle continued. Some things do not become obsolete. They do not get replaced by newer, faster models. They are patient. They are fundamental. They are truths written in the earth itself. They just wait. They wait for people to get quiet enough to listen, to remember why they mattered in the first place, and to understand the simple, enduring power of what lies beneath the surface. They wait for the right person to come along and prove that the old ways are not old, but timeless, 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 timeless,